All right, Gord, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it. And, I've had the honor of being on your podcast. So, the second app podcast. So, we'll give you an opportunity to talk about that a little bit. But, so I'm super excited about this conversation. But before we get started, I always give guests an opportunity to introduce themselves, talk about what it is that they do, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Ferk. I sure appreciate the opportunity to participate in this wonderful forum that you've cultivated for these conversations. Getting to know you over the last year or so, I see some of the work you're putting into some of the difficult conversations, whether it's in men's mental health space or just in people understanding why they feel the way they feel about things, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So yeah, my name is Gord Kitely. I'm a regular dude who works in the oil field in Calgary, Alberta. I'm married. I have 2 kids. I've kind of had a pretty, normal kind of life. Things have gone pretty well. We've had a good run here in oil and gas. A couple of years ago through COVID, there was some changes in my life that kind of made me want to take a step back and look at things around me. And it was an interesting. It was an interesting exercise because I don't think a lot of people that would have known me kind of growing up, you would have described me as self-aware. I was probably one of the least self-aware people that you would have ever known years ago, because I was kind of a big personality and just assumed that everybody liked that. And through all this, I've kind of learned that there's so many other ways that people can be perceived, and I was like confronted with the fact that I wasn't being perceived the way I always thought I was. So I kind of wanted to embark upon a journey like that. And then to your point, I did start a podcast where I kind of decided I needed to figure out how to work with that and talk to people and understand. And so I thought that would be a great way to kind of get to meet new people and go down that path. And through all that, and through a couple of other different, people that you and I know commonly and stuff, I've kind of fallen into this, I don't know if it's a trap, so to speak, but it's like this world of where there's people out there that are on that same journey with me. Some are a little ahead, some are a little behind, some are right on par. Mm-hmm. And it's so much fun to just sit down and talk to those people and figure out where they're at, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And help, like, for the listeners, are you able to help us understand the whole concept behind the Second Act podcast? Because I think there's a deeper meaning behind it, and you've kind of shared your own experience at a high level, but what is the concept behind it, and what really inspired you to want to have these conversations? I know you mentioned trying to get to understand the whole aspect of self-awareness, but there is a deeper meaning behind it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's actually in about 2018, I have emails from 2018 where I came up with this idea, and it was through through work. I met a couple of different people, and one of them is has a reasonably high profile in Calgary, and the other, his business partner, didn't. And once you got to know them both, there was one who was significantly more interesting at a personal level than the other. Both great guys. But it was like, this other guy over here that nobody knows his name is a super interesting guy. He had all these different artistic ventures and these different business interests, and the way he, interacted with people. And I thought to myself, I wonder how many people just on the bus at the grocery store have that second part of their life that nobody's bothered to ask about or nobody's interested in. And what goes into that second act. Mm-hmm. And so I started poking around, and I started realizing that there are so many people out there that are doing something different than what they started out doing, or they got doing something and found the fulfillment wasn't what they thought it was going to be. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze, so to speak. And they just departed and they started doing something different. And those are the stories that we kind of aim to seek out and illustrate on the Second Act podcast. And we've had, a plethora of guests that have different stories. We've had people that have been, in jail, and now they're on the second part of that, coming out and getting their life back. We've had, politicians, and we've had musicians and people that lived a normal, regular 9-to-5 life, and the one lady kind of honed her gift as a psychic medium, and that's what she does. And it's just all these people that you may never think to ask the question about, because they're just a person that's in your life. And meanwhile, they're doing all this incredible stuff, this incredible work in the background to really fulfill their life and make sure that they're getting the most that they can. And those are the stories that we just want to highlight and let people know that they're everywhere.
Yeah. And I think, based on the episodes I've listened to, and I haven't listened to all of them, but there is a common theme, and I want to get your thoughts around that. Like, do you believe the common theme there is all these people at some point in their lives encountered adversity, and we could say adversity is relative, right? There's no way to measure it, but they encountered adversity which almost in a way acted as a catalyst for them to seek out this second act and perhaps look at something different in their lives?
Almost exclusively, Ferk. I would say there's almost no point where someone truly falls into it, like they would say, oh, I just fell into this. No, you didn't. Something happened, and you realized, you had a realization, and you decided that there was something in that spark, in that moment, that you needed to pursue. And it's difficult because sometimes it's not clear to the person. And we've kind of had aha moments on the pod where, we edit it out and the person's like, wow, I never thought of it like that. And you have that conversation in the moment, and then you kind of piece it all together. And then when you listen to the edited podcast, you think, well, that was smooth, but it wasn't. And it never is. And that's kind of the point.
Yeah. And I think that's probably a good segue into our conversation today. So, Gord and I have decided to talk about the ego, and I think both of us came across it because you read it actually every year, but I just read it recently, I would say 3 months ago, Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. And there's an aspect of adversity that we talk about from an ego standpoint as well, and how to manage that. So perhaps before we jump into that, do you want to share why is this book so profound for you that you feel like it's an important read every summer?
So the way that the Ryan Holiday's writing on the Stoics, but specifically Ego is the Enemy, came to me was a former coworker who was really driven by the writing of the Stoics, and specifically Ryan Holiday. The stillness is the key, obstacle is the way, and ego is the enemy trifecta. He was moving on from a role, and he handed me a book, Ego is the Enemy, and inside it just said, hey, I think you might get something out of this. And I have a lot of respect for him. We were good friends. We still are. And on its face, I was like, oh, okay, I'll read it because I respect you and I want to understand why. But when you're handed a book that's called Ego is the Enemy from somebody who's departing out of your day-to-day life, it's like this can go one of two ways, right? And I was already kind of into my direction that maybe things weren't going as well as I'd thought or I'd hoped, and I needed to look at a little more introspectively at how I was reacting to things. So I read the book, and the first time I read it, I was like, this is crazy. Like, all this is when you look at something that happened 1,000 years ago through the lens of current times and with all the lessons that we've learned since, it's really easy to look back at it, or the specific about how Jackie Robinson, did the things that he had to do and kept a stiff upper lip. Well, of course, he's a hero now. It's easy to look back on it. Mm-hmm. So I specifically gave myself 6 months, and then I went back and reread it and had some time to mull it over, had some opportunities to see things in my life and use those lessons learned and lo and behold, it was less threatening. It was more useful. And then every time I've read it since, I I'm a big music guy. So the first time I read about it and I read the chapter about Metallica, that was the one I really honed in on. Well, now that I've read it a half a dozen times, I'm reading some of the other ones that are about some of the philosophers and using those lessons. And lo and behold, all these lessons kind of compound on each other. And so now I find myself every spring really looking forward to the opportunity to dive back into the book and see which one's going to stick with me this year.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about it is there's tons of stories in there that, as you mentioned, you initially gravitated towards the Metallica portion, but there's a lot to take out of it. You mentioned threatening. What about the book, like at least in the beginning, felt threatening? Because I'll share my own experience too. But yeah, what about it was threatening for you?
So if I had not been as aware going into it, I don't think I would have been threatened. But because I was aware that there were some cracks in the way I perceived myself, I felt really threatened about reading that book and wondering what I would see. Was this going to be an expose of Gord? And at that point I was in my early 40s. I'd been fairly successful. My family was healthy. I felt like I'd done all right. And the last thing I really wanted to do was read a book that was going to say, all of that is in spite of these behaviors. And it was threatening to me to want to go in and do that exercise.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you shared that, because that was a very similar experience for me in terms of reading the book. Was the almost humbling in the sense that, my ego shows up almost every day, and it's one of those things you have to be so mindful of, and at least for me, I have to be aware of it when it shows up and presents itself. And the reason why I felt adversity is a great way to start probably talking about the ego, because I've had my times with adversity, and it's easy to be able to blame circumstances or other people for the challenges that come into our lives, and that's the ego really talking from my perspective. And often we have to take a step back and keep that ego in check, but also understand what is it that we're doing to bring those situations into our lives. What is our role, or how are we going to choose to react and show up differently? And those are where some of the realizations I had, even in the smallest things that occur on a daily basis. It's easy to get flustered and blame other people and get upset with other people. So I don't know if you have similar thoughts or what your experiences is, because there's the reason why I'm going with adversity is because the book is broken into 3 sections, and one of them is around failure and how the ego shows up. So I wanted to perhaps touch on that, but yeah.
So the part around that and managing that reaction really sunk in with me about the second or third time through, when the John Wooden portion of the book about how the winningest basketball coach of all time was decidedly dispassionate about things. He did not bring passion. He was purposeful. And as I looked into that was counterintuitive, right? Follow your passions. That's what everybody tells you. If you do what you're passionate about, you'll never work a day in your life. And here we have this person who's kind of by and large accepted as the pinnacle of success in his chosen field. And anyone around him will tell you that he was decidedly dispassionate. And it was the difference between passion and purpose that made it sink in with me is that passion is an emotion and purpose is a reason. And to the uninitiated, and I'm not saying I'm initiated, I'm just saying at this point, this is where I got with it. I was running on emotion almost all the time, through things that had happened in my life. Emotion, I'd always kind of been able to straddle the knife's edge to be emotional enough that I really cared about things, but I never let it spiral out of control. And it was becoming harder and harder as things like my career became more important to my family's well-being. My children became older, and we're interacting with other people. And as anyone who has children can tell you, there's something very, very concerning when your child is, when you're perceiving your child's being attacked. Your emotions take over, and if you don't have control, if you're not able to, carefully vet how you react to that, you're going to be in a world of trouble. And I could see as my kids got older, I was doing that. And that part of the book came along at a really good time where I was like, oh, purpose and passion are different. Passion doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the happiest at the end. And we have to figure out how we're going to react to these things. And it's all based off of the emotion of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what are you doing now to kind of help you maintain that? Because, often we realize things, but then we have to put practices in place to be able to maintain those realizations. So, and I think some of the stuff you mentioned earlier, but what are the things you're doing to maintain some of those realizations?
So the very first thing I did, I realized that I had to do, was to control the things that I can control in my life. And one of the number one things that I did was I really dialed my alcohol consumption back. I was, always having a beer in the garage. That was me. And now it's like, if I'm going to be in control of everything all the time, that was something that I had to take back, as much for my own ability to say that I did it as for anything that happened while I'd been having a beer or two, right? And then the other part is the communication piece with my wife and my family. I'm doing it more planfully. I write a journal, and I go and attend some men's groups so that I'm comfortable with how I feel. I do have a coach that I work with on personal growth, and we have these conversations. I flesh out these ideas so that when I sit down with my children or my wife, I'm not trying to wing it as I go. I've constructed how I feel. I've given reflection to it before we talk about it. And the best part about that is they understand the work that's gone into it. And if I say something that, maybe construed as hurtful or not necessarily what they were expecting, they understand it's not a reaction. They understand that there's been a bunch of work put into it, and that's how I feel. And we have to go from that point and it's not a reaction to something else that's going on around me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's important. And again, thank you for sharing that. I think there's an aspect of vulnerability there, don't you think? And the fact that you're being vulnerable, it gives everyone around you, especially your family, also some grace and compassion for how you're showing up. So like you said, if there is something or whether you make a mistake, I think they're also giving you that compassion and the fact that you're being vulnerable. Do you feel that's helping in that sense?
Absolutely. And one thing that I've learned over the last few years is the vulnerability is always there. It's whether or not you're going to acknowledge it. And people are aware of your vulnerabilities, whether you're willing to acknowledge them or not. The struggle is in that acknowledgement, that self-awareness of the vulnerability. And that's how quickly you're going to get to work on those areas is the sooner that everyone's willing to acknowledge that they're there. And so that's something that I work really hard at. And it's hard to do as a family unit sometimes because not everybody wants to admit their vulnerabilities, and I don't always want to admit mine. There are times where it's hard, but at the end of it, if I want to be, the captain of the team or however you want to say it, I have to lead in a manner that I wish to lead people. And so I work really hard to try to acknowledge those vulnerabilities when I'm having a bad day, bad week, when I'm tired, when I'm not getting the results that I want with the people around me through the interactions that I'm leading. It's really important that I acknowledge the fact that this isn't going well. Let's start over again.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, and it's so important to do. But to your point, very hard to do at times, especially when those emotions, as you alluded to earlier, are raw. It's hard to. I think first of all, my belief is we don't have the language to be able to kind of explain those emotions. So that's a struggle on its own. And then it's also hard to be able to admit them at times, because some of them are difficult emotions to talk about. So I appreciate your point around it is a work in progress, and I think a lot of us are doing the same work, and the fact that we're doing it is obviously helping us move in the right direction. But yeah, so I think we talked about one of the areas of the book around failure and how the ego comes in. Another area is where a lot of us are embarking on something, whether it's a new opportunity, new career, some hobby, new goals in life in general. There's always a lot of hard work that needs to go in at the beginning, and quite often when the results aren't there or the outcomes aren't as we expected them to be, it's easy for the ego to kick in those moments as well, and maybe create a narrative in our mind that where other people are just luckier than us, or good things aren't meant to happen for us and therefore we should give up, or whatever, however the ego wants to trick us. What are your thoughts around that, and what are some things that you've built into your practice, or you think people should kind of work on when we're going through those situations in life, especially early on when you're trying to work towards something?
That's a great point and a great question, I guess, because I did that through starting my podcast. I was fairly certain that I was going to get a good run of guests and things were going to go, and it did. I mean, I had an unbelievable start, kind of first 20 or 25 episodes to my podcast. And then I've hit this opportunity to kind of reflect back and what am I putting into it? What am I getting out of it? And I've kind of fallen into the trap of, relying on what everybody thinks ego is, which is your sense of self-worth, versus what ego actually is, which is how you perceive yourself. And I'm kind of, I have to remind myself that you've had some success. That was the plan. Just because it's not this episode that you thought went really good and should do well isn't a statement or a commentary on you or that guest or how you put it together. It's how it landed. You put out a podcast on Monday about a beer drinking lady, and through the weekend, when you kind of thought that people would pick up on that, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And I mean, I can't control that. That's just how it goes. So did I probably, instead of a bunch of people tweeting and Instagramming about this beer maven that is going around Calgary taking people on these crazy beer tastings, are they tweeting about other things and advertising that? Absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't room for me to improve and I can't do that, but that self-reflection is separate from how I perceive myself and the work that goes into that success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's important as well. And how would you say that's changed from, say, the previous version of Gord, the one you said before this whole self-awareness journey?
Oh man, you don't ask for much, do you? So the previous version of Gord would have had a reasonable amount of reasons why that this was not his fault and he'd done all the right things, because I always was, fairly planful, and I didn't do things very often without reason. So I had it in my head that I had looked at all the angles, and this is my decision. This was the path. It was the best one. And when it didn't work out, it had nothing to do with the fact that I had miscalculated or that something had changed. And to be honest with you, I kind of started to come to terms with this as I started to listen to sports radio, and people would change their picks, and the callers would yell at them about, you said Flames in 6 and now you're saying Flames in 3. And the guy would say, yeah, but I thought Gaudreau wasn't going to be injured. I have new information. I get to change my pick. And in my head, I was like, man, that's so applicable for everything in life. All we do is get new information. And yet somehow, because of our ego, because of the way we perceive ourselves, we're beholden to these decisions that we made so long ago. And it's so absurd, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's we're in a different world too, where anything we go out and say is almost out there now, especially
Yeah.
with social media. You can't really retract stuff, but I think there's and the antidote always for ego is humility, and I think being able to accept the fact that, hey, I had different information at the time, or sometimes we have blind spots too, right? And we don't consider all the information that's in front of us. That's important too. But I think the biggest piece that you mentioned, and I've also appreciated over the last little while, is considering every opportunity as something we can learn from, right? So if the results aren't what we expected, it's understanding why. Why are the results not the same that we thought they were going to be? And sorry, go ahead. You have something to say?
Well, I think it's an interesting concept because the arrogance that goes into the assumption of the result, right? Like that's part of all of this conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a deeper aspect too when you think about it, is why do we want those results to be the way? Like, why did you want this episode to do so well? And I think often there is an aspect of ego attached to that as well, because it's something we're putting out into the universe and we expect it to do really well because we believe we put in all this time and effort and creativity and thought behind it. But there's also millions of people doing the same thing. So what's the difference?
Well, and even an episode of a podcast or a project at work, or even your child, you put all this effort into taking your child to the piano recitals, and you buy the piano and you get the extra lessons, and you put all this effort in, and then they go and they don't get hot cross buns right, and you had this in your head of what it was going to be, and it doesn't meet that. And it goes back to that arrogance from the ego. Like, who are you to assume? And I think that's a really hard thing, that you just get to assume that all this hard work's going to equal success. And I'm not going to get into participation medal culture and all that stuff, but I will say that we don't do a great job of dealing with failure, teaching people to deal with failure, or even accepting it, that it's part of the process. And you'll find the truly successful people, like the Olympic medalists and the people that are, on the, J.K. Rowlings of the world that are wildly successful in their chosen field. Failure is as much a part of their story as anything to do with success. And they've learned to, deal with it, manifest something different out of it. And we don't necessarily do that because we have so much available to us that if we fail at one thing, we're just on to the next one. And we always just assume, because of our ego, that we're going to be better at the next thing based on what, right? No, there's no reason to assume that, but that's kind of where we're at.
Well, and I think there's an aspect of culture too, where, a lot of successful people, you only hear about their successes, right? Like, whether it's the Olympic medalists or as the, successful authors, you don't hear about all the grind and all the times they failed, because that's not really talked about. So
do you believe that though? Or do you, like, I actually would argue that if you want to find out about the grind, there's no end to the avenues with podcasts. And I think there's people that are truly successful that put their failures out there to see.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't believe that. I think the information is there, but through media and stuff, what's talked about generally is the success, right? They're not talking about, this guy failed. And one of the most recent examples I came across was, I happened to read Will Smith's book, and you don't really hear about everything that happened in the background. You kind of know, okay, this kid came out of nowhere, had a successful TV show, and then ended up becoming the most successful actor in Hollywood history. But you don't talk about, or at least it's not talked about in terms of like him basically being broke at one point.
Yeah.
Until he shared it in his book, right? So I think there is an aspect of culture where a lot of people almost are misled or assume that everyone's successful in their field. They just were talented, and then they picked it up and became successful, and there's not a lot of conversation around all the hard work that went behind it and all those failures that allowed them to learn from those failures.
Well, and think of the, I don't know what the right term is, but how secure Will Smith has to be in his position, going on with all that's going on in the world around him, to put that out there in a book, right? Like that, that's an ego-based thing as well, that he's in a position where he can say, look, I'm good enough today that I will tell you how bad it was before. And a lot of people won't do the bad as was before until it's good enough today. And what happens if you never get there? Then, to your point, nobody will ever talk about it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So yeah, I think in terms of, when you're aspiring for something, obviously there's going to be failures and obstacles along the way. What's kind of your biggest takeaway from that aspect when it comes to the ego?
Well, the biggest takeaway around trying to avoid the failure while you're aspiring is to be comfortable with the fact that you're not going to avoid the failure while you're aspiring. You have to be ready for it. You have to be aware of it. You have to recognize early when things aren't going in a manner that you'd wish or that you'd hoped, so that you can make the adjustments. Now that's a hard thing to do. That's around that self-awareness piece that we talked about. But the other part of it is actually being able to commit to making the change that is required to come. And that's where I struggled. I had changes in my life that I recognized weren't compatible with who I was and how I lived. But I put my hand up and said, I'm willing to make changes so that we're more in alignment. I really wasn't, because I didn't believe in it. Now it resulted in a bunch of changes in my life, better, worse, and different. But I didn't have both pieces, and that's the critical piece. Is if you have to recognize it, and then you have to be able to commit to make the change, or make the change in your life, one or the other. And that to me is the hardest part, because it requires so much introspection, so much self-reflection, and you have to be serious about it, because if you're fake about it, if you're not taking it seriously, everybody will see it.
Yeah, no, that's so important, and yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I guess the last part of the book that I want to touch, and I think that's probably, in my mind, the hardest and most fascinating for me, is when you're successful and how the ego kicks in. And there's times where people, I think myself included at one point in my life, I did feel invincible because I had everything I had possibly dreamt of. The family, the house, the car, the job, the career, everything. And yeah, there was this sense of pride in my life, and I would say almost arrogance around, okay, well, I've done everything,
yeah,
so anything I'm going to touch is going to turn to gold. But I think there's, again, the aspect of humility that needs to come in, and for us to always remember where we started. At least for me, that was kind of the biggest reminder, and how quickly things can get taken away. And I think also building some compassion for other people. But what are your thoughts around that when ego takes over, especially when we're at the height of something?
Well, it's very difficult, I think, to recognize that you're at the height of something, and when you're working towards something and you're starting to realize those goals and the fruits of that labor, if you're not, if you don't have people around you that will hold you to a dose of humility, it's really easy to end up on a trajectory where you think, I deserve this because I've done this, not realizing that your starting blocks might have been so far ahead of the guy behind you that he's worked just as hard for a fraction of what you have. And there's all that goes into those calculations and equations as well. But I just think that if you're being serious and honest about what your goals were all along, and you're managing them, there's an opportunity every step of the way to avoid those pratfalls. It's when the goal as a 22-year-old college graduate is to be a director at a company. There's so much that can happen in between there that you can lose your way. If the goal is to find and secure employment, that's a goal, manageable goal. And then from there, you get into a company and you say, I want to be a sales lead by the time I'm 25. That's a goal you can manage. If you just find yourself at 34 years old as a director with the house, with the family, with the car, you're going to gloss over a lot of what actually went into making that happen and chalk it up to, hey, I'm just Gord and these things happen for me, right?
Yeah. So what are some things that people can do, though, to be mindful of that? Because I know for me, it's always, again, I had to go through some difficult experiences to really recognize that. But just constantly reminding myself that, I still need to work hard, continue to work hard, but also be grateful for anything that comes into my life. And I think the biggest piece for me is being able to give back and serve people. But those are things that I keep in my daily practice to able to keep my ego in check. It's still hard because often I catch myself still, whether it's having a debate or having a conversation and thinking I know more or I know it all. That often happens, and I have to keep that in check. But what are some things that work for you, or some things that you do to keep yourself in check?
So the two things that I am consciously aware of that I do is I curate the people in my life. I make sure the people in my life are going to hold me to account, hold me to a higher standard. And I make sure that I'm not getting away with things, whether it's, not taking care of myself, not spending time with my family. There's going to be people that are like, come on, we should be golfing 72 holes a week. There's people out there that do that. I could find those people and I could go golf 72 holes a week, but that's not who I am. Who I am is the guy who has to plan a week ahead of time or 10 days ahead of time to get out for 18 holes every 3 weeks. So I try to align myself with people that are similarly minded so that I don't find myself getting out into an area where, and as a younger man, I very much was the guy who wanted to go quadding every weekend while my wife was home with the kids. Well, I mean, come on, that's not sustainable. That's not what this is all about. That's not why we entered into all of this. And as I've said that, I completely forgot the second part of what I was going to say. So I don't know if you can edit that out or not.
Well, I think, so first part you said surrounding yourself with like-minded people. But I'm curious about, because you mentioned earlier you had, the first 20, 25 episodes were successful, as you mentioned. So when that was happening, obviously starting a podcast is not an easy task. There's a lot of vulnerability attached to it. You're putting yourself out there. You're exposing yourself to criticism. So when things did go well, how were you able to maintain that aspect of ego and still have that humility and continue to do more with the same level of excitement and passion?
Well, the passion never wavered, or the excitement level never wavered. So it was easy. It was a self-fulfilling thing. And by the time I hit, I think episode 25 was my first episode that ever cracked 1,000 downloads. And it was like, this is easy. When you're seeing that kind of response, it was no trouble at all to keep it going. And there was enough, because there's a guest on each podcast, there was enough correlation between the really interesting guests, or the ones whose story was just a little unique, or maybe they were a little more engaged. They would do just better than some of the other ones, that I kind of understood that I was just as dependent on the guest as me. Talking to some people that have podcasts and coach people, they want to get away from that. Ultimately, you need people to want to tune in to listen to your take on their story, and that's how you maintain that steady trajectory. And I think I kind of thought, okay, I've got this base, I've got these numbers that are holding pretty steady through 25 episodes, and I started to do some other ones that I found more interesting, and maybe I just didn't have people tuning in to hear my take on their story yet. And maybe that's kind of why things leveled out. They haven't dropped. It's still going well, but I certainly haven't maintained that. And maybe I never was going to. Maybe there's that part of it too. I'm not sure.
Yeah. But how were you able to, at least when you saw that success, maintain like the ego though? Because I think it's easier to get carried away, right? Like I think if I'm just putting myself in those shoes. Like, I've had some episodes that have taken off too, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, here we go.
Yeah.
But often reality hits, and you're like, okay, well, I still have a long ways to go here. So,
yeah, but even on your journey in a similar vein, you just know that it's not you. Even when it's going really well, you're a part of it.
yes.
You just know that because there's so many variables. We talked about the news cycles that happen and the different things. I've had people that have a small social media following that promote an episode that they appear on very hard, and it does really well. I have people that have a large social media following that don't mention it, and I'm tagging them, and that's how their audience is finding them, and it doesn't do as well. And I can't control all of that. So by the time I kind of got into, episodes, let's say 30 through 50, I had a pretty good handle on this is how I do it. I've done my research. I look at my analytics and see when the people that interact with my content, when they're on, I make sure that I get my stuff out during those times. The captioned videos do well. The reels on Sunday introducing don't, so I changed up how I do that. You know what I mean? Like that's how I'm managing that. I don't think I've ever kind of took it all for granted that people were tuning in to hear my voice or see my face.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great, and it's important, as you mentioned, like the experimentation, because even when we feel like we've reached some level of success, it's always important to recognize that we can still learn, and there's always something to learn and improve on. And I think there's a lot of stories that were shared by Ryan Holiday in that book as well, around these people who continue to maintain that same level of drive and thirst for knowledge to be able to continue that level of success. And there's others who, as you mentioned, take it for granted, and often that success is short-lived.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the more refined your goal is, the easier it is to stay driven towards it. I think if your goal is to be famous, well, maybe TikTok dancing or a podcast or unboxing videos on YouTube is your way there. If your goal is to meet interesting people and share their stories in a fashion that is repeatable week over week, so people know where to come to find that, then maybe the Second Act podcast is the way to do it. Now, one of them is going to be harder to do because it's more defined, right? Just by its nature.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Gord, I appreciate everything you've shared and shared your insight here with the listeners, especially when it pertains to the ego. But as we come to a close here, are there any last items you want to share that we probably didn't capture, or anything you want to highlight for listeners who are interested in working on themselves, having that level of self-awareness, or even trying to figure out how to keep that ego in check?
Well, the thing I try to teach my 14-year-old son, because of course as a father you want to take all the hard lessons away from him and just impart the wisdom, is that nobody is paying as much attention to what you're doing as you think they are. So fail, be comfortable with it, embrace it, understand why, and don't let your ego get in the way of the learnings that come, because you've already paid for the lesson. you've got the bill in your pocket. Take the learnings, and that's a tough one because, of course, nobody likes to fail, and everybody feels like when you strike out at baseball, the whole place is watching you because you're standing in the middle. But realistically, no one's paying any attention. They're only there to watch their kids, and they're just happy that you struck out, not their kid, or whatever it is. So that's my. I wish I'd had a little bit more comfort level with things not going the way I'd hoped earlier in my life. I'm not sure how different my life would be, but I feel like I'd probably have saved myself a lot of heartache.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for for a teenage boy, how's that received? Because I often try to impart wisdom on my son, and I see the eye rolls. But so it's kind of like recognizing that, okay, well, I can share the wisdom, but I can also say, well, here's your choices. And sometimes you're going to have to learn from the consequences of those choices. But I could tell you there's another way. But ultimately, it's your life and it's your lesson.
Yeah, I mean, emotionally, he's a 14-year-old boy. So he's not ready to regulate the emotions in a manner that make that valuable or even remotely useful advice. But, cognitively, he understands that, yes, this is what dad is saying is correct, but it's just, I mean, all the other things that go on in a 14-year-old boy's body, that emotional regulation piece is so far down the list that we struggle with it. And, all we can do is let him know that emotional regulation piece doesn't, it's not who he is. It's a part of who he is today. And the more you work on it today, the easier it'll get tomorrow. And eventually you'll get to a point where it is a piece of who he is. And hopefully, the downs don't have to be his downs, so that the highs happen a little more often.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I guess for listeners that want to either check out your podcast or find you online or social media, what are some of the ways they can do that?
I really appreciate that opportunity, Ferk. Yeah, so I have the Second Act podcast. It's available on Spotify and Apple and Google and all the places you find podcasts. We're pretty active on Instagram and Twitter at the Second Act Pod, and we're got some fun stuff lined up for the summer. We've had a pretty good run here with some really kind of heavy topics, some people that are doing some heavy, mental health stuff. I've got one this week coming up with a lady named Kara Fogwell from the Wellness Initiative that I'm really excited about. But we also have some fun ones. We've talked to Quick Dick McDick, and we talked to the former Premier of Saskatchewan, Brad Wall, about getting out of politics. It's a unique mix. There's a lot of cool, fun stories out there of people that are doing different things with their life, that not everything has to be exactly what you wrote down on your little piece of paper when you were in kindergarten when you said you wanted to be a fireman or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, as we mentioned, one of the biggest things is it's never too late to make a change. At the same time, you also have to kind of be aware of your ego if you want to make change and do something more fulfilling and be able to often even live life with your purpose. I think a lot of people do get stuck in that mindset that I can't make a change, and those stories are all very inspiring to consider when you think about it.
Yeah, it's unique to listen to somebody who was, even there's some people that were wildly successful, but they weren't happy, and they made the change, and they talk about what goes into those conversations with themselves just before they close their eyes at night. And it's an ego check for everybody to have to go through that and start from, maybe not scratch, but from way back from where they were. And it was no different, for me to go and put that podcast out there. It was just before you hit post, there was a lot of trepidation, and then you start to meet people who are listening to it and enjoy it. And it doesn't have to be thousands and thousands of people. It can be tens of people. And that's all it is for me. And I wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you again, Gord. I appreciate you taking the time and giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. And thank you for being open and sharing a lot of stuff that I'm sure would be hard to share.
Yeah, no, it was great to be on, Ferk, and I really appreciate the opportunity.